The form had 47 fields. Myvana so filled them in the order prescribed by Section 11 of the Interspecies Transit Authority's boarding manual, pausing at field 31, because the drop-down menu for physiological vulnerability classification had been updated since her last crossing and now contained 209 options instead of 196. She selected Thinara, prey herd, obligate herbivore, low gravity acclimated, panic response certified, and moved to field 32, which asked whether she had been briefed on the presence of class 4 or higher predatory species aboard the vessel. She ticked yes. She had not in fact been briefed, but she had read the manifest summary posted on the embarkation terminal, and she had seen the single line that made her stomach clench and her secondary eyelids slide shut for 3 involuntary seconds. Human passenger, compartment 7 aft, transit designation, observer. Myvana was a census coordinator for the Vethiri Demographic Bureau. She traveled between stations, counted populations, filed variance reports, and returned. She was not military. She was not diplomatic. She was a clerk who carried a stylus and a case of formatted data slates, and she had been assigned passage aboard the survey cruiser Tailing Ka for a routine 11-day transit to the shelf colonies, because it was the only vessel departing orbital Keshtava 3 before the budget quarter closed. The human was incidental. That was what she told herself as she dragged her case through the boarding corridor, her hooves clicking against the composite flooring in the rapid 4-beat pattern that her species could not suppress when cortisol was elevated. Other Thinara passengers were already aboard. She could hear them in the forward compartments, the low communal hum of herd proximity that her neurology craved. She wanted to go to them. She wanted to press her flank against another warm body and let the hum settle her adrenal glands. Instead, she followed the corridor to her assigned berth in Section 7. Aft, the same section as the human. Her berth was 714. The human was in 702. She passed the door and did not look at it. She entered her berth, stowed her case, and sat on the bunk with her knees together and her ears rotated fully forward, which was the Thinara posture for controlled alertness. Her tail was flat against the mattress. A Thinara whose tail was flat was a Thinara who was managing fear. The Tailing Ka undocked 14 minutes later. Myvana felt the gentle shudder of separation, heard the hull groan settle into transit harmonics, and opened her first data slate to begin pre-arrival population projections for shelf colony Veskami. She worked for 2 hours. The numbers were clean. The projections were routine. She filled 9 pages of formatted output and flagged 2 anomalies for secondary review, and the entire time she was aware, in the prey brainstem that her species had never evolved past, that there was a predator 42 meters down the corridor. Not a Krev, whose aggression was territorial and predictable. Not a Sorshi, whose hunting instinct was chemically suppressed by station-standard atmospheric additives. A human, the species for which no atmospheric additive had been found effective. The species whose threat rating the Interspecies Behavioral Index had revised upward 11 times in 30 standard years without once revising it downward. Myvana saved her work, closed the slate, and walked to the communal galley. The human was already there. He was sitting at the far table, the one nearest the viewport, with a ceramic mug in front of him and a portable reading device propped against the wall. He was not eating. He was not moving. He was looking at the device, and his body was so still that Myvana's pattern recognition cortex flagged it before her conscious mind could intervene. Stillness. Not the stillness of sleep or exhaustion, not the stillness of a Thinara in freeze loss, the involuntary paralysis that preceded flight. This was the stillness of something that did not need to move, something that was exactly where it wanted to be and had no metabolic or neurological pressure to be elsewhere. Myvana had read about it. The literature called it neutral resting state. The xenobehavioral monographs she had studied during her transit certification described it as the baseline human posture during non-engaged wakefulness. They described it clinically. They did not describe what it felt like to walk into a room and encounter it. It felt like the room had a center of gravity, and the center was him. She took a nutrient pack from the dispenser, sat at the nearest table to the door, and opened it with fingers that she was disappointed to find were not entirely steady. The human did not look up. He turned a page on his device, lifted his mug, drank, and set it down. The motion was economical. No wasted arc. No overshoot. The mug returned to exactly the spot it had left, and Myvana realized she was cataloging his movements the way she cataloged census data, assigning each one a variance value against expected prey species norms. Every value was 0. He was doing nothing unexpected. He was sitting in a galley, reading, drinking from a mug. Her adrenal glands did not care. They had identified the stillness pattern and classified it, and the classification was predator at rest, and the recommended response was do not draw attention, do not break the stillness, do not be the thing that moves. She ate her nutrient pack in 11 minutes, rinsed the container, and left. The human did not look up. That night, lying in her berth with the transit harmonics vibrating through the bulkhead, she pulled up the interspecies behavioral index on her personal terminal and searched for the entry on humans. It was long, 741 pages, cross-referenced to 92 supplementary annexes. She scrolled to the section on baseline physiological indicators and found a table comparing resting state micro-movements across 26 predatory species. CREV, continuous low-amplitude postural shifts at a rate of 4 to 6 per minute. Sorshi, rhythmic gill-slit flutter at 0.8 Hz. Pelvesi, dermal ripple patterns cycling at 2-second intervals. Every predatory species on the index showed some form of involuntary resting movement. Some constant physiological fidget that signaled the organism was alive and processing. Humans, the column read 0 measurable postural deviation during sustained attention. A footnote clarified, the absence of micro-movement is not an instrument error. Human skeletal musculature can maintain isometric holds exceeding 20 minutes without visible tremor. This capability is consistent with ambush and stalking behaviors observed in their evolutionary record. Myvana closed the terminal. She lay in the dark with her ears rotating and her tail pressed flat and her cortisol elevated, and she thought, he is 42 meters away, and he is probably reading, and he is probably still, and the ship's environmental sensors probably cannot distinguish him from the furniture. She did not sleep well. Day 2. Myvana completed her Veskami projections and began the secondary dataset for shelf colony Rethansol. The numbers for Rethansol were less clean. There was a migration variance of 11% that did not match any registered transit pattern, and she spent 4 hours cross-referencing embarkation logs before she found the discrepancy buried in a batch of misclassified short-hop permits. She was good at this, finding the number that did not fit, pulling the thread until the pattern revealed itself. It was the thing she was best at, and she had been doing it for 19 years, and it was the closest thing she had to a predator's skill, this capacity to see what was wrong in a field of data that looked right. She went to the galley at the same time. The human was there again, same table, same mug, same device, same stillness. But this time when she entered, his eyes moved. Not his head, not his body, his eyes. They tracked her from the door to the dispenser to her table, and then they returned to his device, and the entire scan had taken less than 2 seconds, and Myvana understood with a clarity that made her knees soften that he had just assessed her the way she assessed datasets. He had noted her position, her trajectory, her pace, her physiological state, and he had filed it. And he had returned to what he was doing because the assessment was complete, and the result was not interesting. She was not a threat. She was not novel. She was a data point he had already acquired. She sat down. She opened her nutrient pack. Her hooves were clicking against the floor in the 4-beat stress pattern, and she could not stop them. The human glanced at her hooves, one glance, then back to his device. He had heard the pattern, she was certain of it. And she was certain that he had decoded it, because the xenobehavioral briefings issued to human travelers included a section on Thanara stress indicators, and hoof cadence was on page 3, and this human had the look of someone who read briefings. He knew she was afraid of him. He did nothing with the information. That was worse. Day 3. The tailing car passed through the Meekith Strait, a region of compressed transit lanes where vessels from 9 different species blocks converged into a single corridor for 11 hours before dispersing. The ship's alert system issued standard proximity notifications every 40 minutes. Each notification triggered Myvena's startle reflex, a full-body flinch that she could dampen but not eliminate. And by the 6th notification, she had given up on her Rithansol data and was sitting in the observation lounge watching the traffic through the viewport. The human sat down across the lounge. He did not sit near her. He sat at the opposite end, 8 meters away, and he leaned back and watched the traffic the same way she was watching it, and Myvena realized that this was the first time she had seen him outside the galley. He had been in his berth, or he had been in the galley, and now he was here, and the reason he was here was the viewport, because the Meekith Strait was, she had to admit, spectacular. The compressed lanes created visible distortion fields, and the ships moving through them left iridescent wakes in the medium, and it was beautiful. The human was watching it the way he watched everything, still, attentive, missing nothing. A proximity notification sounded. Myvena flinched. The human did not. He did not flinch, did not tense, did not blink. The sound passed through him the way sound passes through stone. She found herself staring at him. She had never seen a biological organism that did not respond to an abrupt auditory stimulus. Even Krev, whose hearing was limited, showed ear flick reflexes. Even Sorshi, who were partially deaf in the high register, showed pupil dilation. The human showed nothing. She looked away before he could notice her staring. But she suspected, with the part of her brain that was beginning to understand something she did not want to understand, that he had already noticed, and that he was allowing her the dignity of believing she had looked away in time. Later that day, she passed him in the corridor. The passage was narrow enough that they had to angle their bodies to clear each other, and as they did, Myvena experienced something that she would spend 2 hours trying to articulate in her personal data slate that evening. He adjusted his path for her. Not dramatically, not with any visible deference or accommodation. He simply shifted his trajectory by perhaps 10 centimeters to his right, giving her the wider berth, and he did it early, before they were close enough for it to be a reactive correction, which meant he had calculated the convergence point, assessed the available space, determined that she would be more comfortable with additional clearance, and adjusted, all before she had consciously registered that they were about to pass each other. The entire interaction lasted 4 seconds. He nodded as they passed. She nodded back. Her hooves accelerated into the 4-beat pattern the moment she was past him, and she heard them hammering against the composite, and she could not stop them. He had predicted her spatial needs before she had identified them herself. He had modeled her comfort threshold, accounted for it, and adapted, and the adaptation was so seamless and so early that she would not have noticed it at all if she had not been watching him with the hypersensitivity of a prey animal, whose entire cognitive apparatus was locked onto the only predator in the corridor. He was not merely still, he was precise. Every movement he made, when he chose to make one, was calibrated to a tolerance that no prey species would ever need, because prey species moved to escape, and escape did not require precision. It required speed and panic and the willingness to crash through obstacles. Predators moved to intercept, and interception required knowing exactly where the target would be. He had known exactly where she would be. Day 4. She was in the galley when the incident happened. There were 9 passengers in the room, 4 Thinara including Mivana, 2 Krev freight handlers, a Sorshi academic traveling to the same conference circuit as the survey team, a Pelvesi maintenance contractor, and the human. The argument started between the Krev. Freight handlers argued frequently. It was a dominance maintenance behavior that their species managed through vocal escalation rather than physical confrontation. Mivana had seen it dozens of times. It was loud, it was aggressive, and it was, she knew intellectually, harmless. Her adrenal glands did not know this intellectually. Her adrenal glands heard 2 large predatory organisms raising their voices in an enclosed space, and they responded with the full cascade, and she was on her feet with her chair pushed back before she could stop herself, and the other 3 Thinara were doing the same thing, and the Sorshi had gone rigid, and the Pelvesi had flattened against the wall. The Krev were oblivious. They were shouting about cargo manifests. One of them slammed a fist on the table, and the sound was enormous in the metal-walled room, and Mivana's legs locked in freeze loss, the involuntary paralysis that preceded a Thinara's flight reflex, and she could not move, and her vision was narrowing, and her secondary eyelids had sealed shut, and she was standing in a galley on a transit cruiser unable to move because 2 freight handlers were having a labor dispute. She heard a chair scrape. Not fast, not loud, a slow, deliberate scrape, the sound of someone standing up without urgency. The Krev stopped shouting. They stopped at exactly the same moment, and Mivana's secondary eyelids opened in time to see why. The human was standing. He had risen from his chair and he was standing at his table, and he was not doing anything. He was not speaking. He was not making a gesture. He was not flexing or posturing or displaying. He was standing and he was looking at the 2 Krev, and the 2 Krev were looking at him. The room was silent. Mivana's freeze loss broke, not because the threat had passed, but because her prey brain had identified a larger pattern and needed her cognitive resources to process it. The Krev were both apex-rated predatory species. They were each twice the human's mass. They had bone-reinforced forearms and dentition designed for tearing, and they were both frozen, and they were frozen because a 60-kilogram primate had stood up. The human looked at them for 4 seconds. Then he sat back down, picked up his mug, and drank. The Krev sat down. They did not resume their argument. One of them left the galley within a minute. The other stared at his food for a while, then left too. Mivana sat down. Her legs were shaking, not from the Krev, from the human. She had just watched a predatory species submit to a display that contained no aggression, no threat, no vocalization, no physical superiority. The human had done nothing. He had stood. He had looked, and the room had reorganized itself around his stillness. She went back to her berth and opened the behavioral index again. This time, she searched for recorded instances of human dominance resolution in mixed species environments. There were 47 documented cases. In 39 of them, the human had resolved the situation without physical contact, without vocalization, and without any gesture that met the index's formal definition of a threat display. In 26 of them, the human had not been aware that they were resolving anything. The index had a term for it: passive apex reorganization. It defined it as the involuntary restructuring of a social hierarchy by the presence of an organism whose behavioral profile communicates maximal threat potential through minimal behavioral output. The definition had a clinical detachment that Mivana found almost comforting, because it meant that someone, somewhere, had studied this phenomenon with the same analytical rigor she was now applying, and they had found words for it, and the words were precise, and precision was the only thing that made the world manageable. But the definition also had a footnote, and the footnote said, "No effective countermeasure has been identified. The The behavior is neurologically involuntary on both sides. The human cannot suppress the broadcast. The observers cannot suppress the response. The hierarchy reorganizes on contact. On contact, not on threat, not on aggression, on contact. The human had entered the galley, and the galley had rearranged itself. Every time, every day. Day 5. She could not stop thinking about it. She tried to work. She opened the reorganizes dataset and stared at the numbers, and the numbers were correct and clean, and she could not focus on them because her analytical cortex was churning on a different dataset entirely, one that had no columns and no rows and no formatting, one that was built from the way a man held a mug and the way two predators froze when he stood. She closed the reorganizes data slate and opened the personal one. She had 27 pages now. She read them from the beginning. She read them the way she would read a population anomaly report, looking for the underlying variable that explained the surface pattern, and the underlying variable was obvious. It had been obvious since day 1. She had simply been too afraid to name it. Every organism on this ship, prey and predator alike, was performing for the room. The Thanara hummed and clustered and displayed herd cohesion behaviors that communicated safety in numbers. The Krev argued and postured and physically occupied space in ways that communicated territorial claim. The Sorshi maintained academic conversation to communicate intellectual status. The Pelvesi vibrated social signals through contact surfaces to communicate affiliative intent. The human communicated nothing. He performed nothing. He broadcast no intentional social signal, and the absence of signal was itself the most powerful signal in the room because it said, "I do not need you to know what I am. I already know what you are." She was a census coordinator. She found patterns. It was her function, her skill, the thing that justified her salary and her transit authorizations and her 19 years of formatted data slates. And the pattern she was seeing now was one that none of her professional training had prepared her for, but that her prey brain had been screaming at her about since boarding. The human did not react to stimuli. He generated them. Every organism Myvana had ever observed, including herself, was fundamentally reactive. Sounds triggered flinches. Movement triggered tracking. Proximity triggered assessment. The world acted on you, and you responded, and your responses were the data that other organisms read to determine what you were. The human operated in reverse. He did not respond to the world. The world responded to him. His stillness was not passivity. It was a broadcast. It said, "I have assessed everything in this room, and nothing in this room requires me to change what I am doing." It said, "I am the thing in this room that is not afraid." And every other organism in the room, predator and prey alike, received that broadcast and reorganized their behavior around it. The Krev had not submitted to his size. They had not submitted to a threat. They had submitted to the information content of his stillness, which communicated, without a single word or gesture, that he was the variable in the room that they could not predict, and the thing that cannot be predicted is the thing that is feared. Myvana opened a new data slate. She labeled it personal observation, not for filing, and she began to write. Day 6. The tailing car made a scheduled stop at way station Peller 9 for fuel resupply and crew rotation. Passengers were permitted to disembark for the 6-hour layover. Myvana walked through the way station's commercial ring, bought a container of pressed root tea because the ship's dispenser only stocked Krev blends that upset her digestion, and found herself standing at the entrance to the way station's xenobehavioral archive. It was a small archive. Way station libraries were curated for transit passengers, not researchers. But it had a terminal, and the terminal had access to the interspecies behavioral index, and Myvana sat down and searched for human stillness behavior. What she found made her put down her tea. The literature was not large. 11 papers, 3 conference proceedings, 1 monograph. The monograph was by a Sorshi behavioral economist named Dreeth Palavan, and it was titled Predatory Patience: Resting State Behavioral Asymmetry in Humans and Its Implications for Interspecies Threat Assessment. Myvana read the abstract and felt her secondary eyelids close. The paper argued that human stillness was not a resting state, it was a hunting state. Paleobiological evidence indicated that humans had evolved on a world where their primary survival strategy was not speed, not strength, not venom, not armor, but patience. They tracked prey across distances that no other terrestrial predator could sustain, and the final stage of their pursuit was not a sprint or a lunge or a pounce. It was a wait. They sat near the exhausted animal and watched it. They waited until it could no longer run, and then they walked to it. The paper called it persistence predation, and it noted that the neurological architecture supporting it had never been deactivated. Modern humans, living in stations and ships and cities that bore no resemblance to the grasslands where the strategy evolved, still carried the full cognitive suite. The capacity for sustained observation without fatigue, the suppression of reflexive startle responses, the ability to maintain a stable metabolic state during prolonged inactivity, and the integration of continuous environmental scanning with apparent behavioral disengagement. They looked like they were doing nothing. They were doing everything. They were watching. Myvana read the paper twice. Then she searched for citation responses. There were 4. 3 agreed with Palavan's framework and extended it. The 4th, by a Thanara academic named Savan Resh, disagreed only on the question of whether the behavior was purely vestigial or actively maintained through cultural reinforcement, and concluded that it did not matter, because the effect on interspecies dynamics was identical either way. The effect was this: in any mixed species environment, the organism that displays the least reactive behavior is perceived as the apex, not the largest, not the strongest, not the one with the most weapons, the one that moves the least. Humans move the least. Not because they were slow. Their reaction times, when they chose to react, were among the fastest recorded for any biological organism of comparable mass. They moved the least because they had evolved to conserve reaction for the moment it mattered, and in the meantime, their stillness functioned as an involuntary dominance display that reorganized every social hierarchy in every room they entered. The Krev in the galley had not known any of this. They had not read Palavan's monograph. They did not need to. Their neurology, like Myvana's, like the Sorshis, like the Pelvesis, was calibrated to read behavioral cues that predated language and culture and conscious thought. And the cue, the human broadcast, was the oldest one in the biological lexicon. I am the one who waits. You are the one who runs. Myvana closed the terminal. She picked up her tea. She walked back to the tailing car with her hooves clicking in the 4-beat pattern the entire way, and she did not care who heard it. On the reboarding ramp, she passed the human. He was returning from somewhere in the way station, carrying a small cloth bag that appeared to contain food items. He walked at a pace that she had by now cataloged as his default, unhurried, even metrically consistent. She had timed it on 3 separate occasions. His stride length varied by less than 2 centimeters. His pace varied by less than 1/10 of a second per step. His walking was as calibrated as his sitting, and the calibration was not effort. It was architecture. His body was built for sustained, efficient, unwavering forward movement, and the engineering specifications had not changed in 100,000 years. He nodded to her as they passed. She nodded back. She did not flinch. She did not accelerate. Her hooves maintained the 4-beat pattern, but she held eye contact for 1 full second before looking away, and she counted that as progress. Day 7, she began watching him deliberately. Not from the galley, from the observation lounge, where the seating arrangement allowed her to position herself at an angle where her natural field of vision included his location without requiring her to turn her head. She was a prey species. Her eyes were lateral. She could observe him without facing him, and she suspected, without being entirely sure, that he did not know she was doing it. He read. He drank his tea or his coffee, she could not tell which. He watched the viewport. He spoke to the Sorshi academic once, a brief exchange about transit schedules that lasted 90 seconds and contained no emotional content. He nodded to the Pelvesi in the corridor. He did not speak to any of the Thanara passengers, and Mivana wondered whether this was deliberate, whether the human briefings had told him that approaching a prey-herd species without invitation would trigger a flight response, and whether he was observing that protocol out of genuine consideration or out of the same calculated patience that Palavan's monograph described. She could not tell, and that, she was beginning to understand, was the point. The human's behavior was unreadable not because it was complex, but because it was simple. He did ordinary things. He sat. He read. He drank. He walked to the galley and back. And every one of these ordinary actions was performed with a stillness and economy that her neurology could not classify as anything other than predatory, because it matched no prey-species behavioral profile in her instinctive library, and the only template that fit was the one she least wanted to apply. She wrote 12 pages of observations in her personal data slate: arrival times, departure times, duration of galley visits, beverage selection patterns, reading posture angles. Response latency to auditory stimuli, 0 visible response across all observed instances. Interaction frequency with other passengers by species, Crev, 0 after day 4, Sorshi, 1 brief exchange, Pelvesi, 1 corridor greeting, Thanara, 0. The data was meticulous. It was thorough. It was the best census quality observation work she had ever produced. And when she read it back, she realized what she had done. She had profiled him. She had subjected a fellow passenger to the same analytical framework she used on population datasets, cataloging his patterns and habits and rhythms with the obsessive precision of a scientist studying a specimen. And she had done it because she was afraid of him, and the fear had activated the only tool she had that resembled a predator's capability: the ability to observe and categorize and know. She had tried to become the one who watches. She stared at her data slate for a long time. Then she closed it, went to the galley, and sat down at the table next to his. Not across the room, not at the table nearest the door, next to his. The human looked up from his device. His eyes met hers, and they were the flat, steady eyes that she had been studying for 7 days, and they held no aggression and no warmth and no readable intent, and they waited. "My name is Mivana So," she said. "I am a census coordinator for the Vethiri Demographic Bureau. I have been observing you since we boarded, and I believe you know that." The human looked at her for 3 seconds. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, something smaller, something that might have been recognition. "James Oren," he said, "and yes, since day 2. Mivana's ears flattened. "You knew. You changed your galley schedule to match mine on day 2. You used the observation lounge sightline on day 7. You have a 4-beat hoof pattern when you're stressed, and it's been running since boarding." He said it without judgment, without triumph. He said it the way Mivana reported census variances, a neutral recitation of observed data. "I read a monograph," she said, "about your species, about patience, about what your stillness means." "Palavan." She blinked both sets of eyelids. "You have read it. It's on the recommended reading list for human travelers, section 4 of the transit briefing." He picked up his mug. "They want us to know what we look like to you, so we can be conscious of it." "And are you conscious of it?" He drank, set the mug down. "Same spot. 0 variance. I'm sitting in a galley reading a novel about a fishing village on my homeworld. My heart rate is 62 beats per minute. I haven't had an adrenaline spike since I boarded. I am, by every physiological measure available, at rest." He paused. and I am aware that my version of rest is indistinguishable to most species in this galaxy from a hunting posture. Mivana's tail was flat against her chair. You cannot change it. No. You cannot stop being still. No more than you can stop the hoof pattern. She considered this. The Krev in the galley, day 4. They were having an argument about cargo. I stood up to get more water. They stopped. You stood up to get water. The dispenser is behind them. I needed to walk past them. Mivana stared at him. That was not a dominance display. I was thirsty. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. They read it as a dominance display. Every organism in that room read it as a dominance display. The Sorshi went rigid. The Pelvesi flattened against the wall. I went into freeze loss. I know, he said. And his voice was the flattest thing she had ever heard, flat like a horizon, flat like a plane. And she understood that this was the voice of a species that had spent 1,000,000 years walking across flatlands toward animals that could not outrun them. And the voice carried no guilt and no apology because the man in front of her had not chosen this, had not trained for it, had not cultivated it. He had inherited it. It was as involuntary as her 4-beat hoof pattern, as automatic as her secondary eyelids, as old as the bones in his legs that were designed for walking distances that would kill every other species in this galley. You did not choose to be a predator, she said. No, but you are one. I am a transit passenger reading a novel about fishing. You are a transit passenger reading a novel about fishing, and you reorganize the dominance hierarchy of a galley containing 2 apex-rated Krev by standing up. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had been watching him, something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite. A softening, perhaps. A recognition that she had said something true and that the truth of it was not comfortable for either of them. Would it help, he said, if I told you that I reorganized the dominance hierarchy of rooms full of humans too? Mivana's ears rotated. That is not possible. You are all the same species. There are humans who are still and there are humans who are not. The still ones tend to end up in charge. It's not a rule. It's not policy. It's the same thing you're describing. We read each other's stillness the same way you read it. We just have a higher threshold before it registers as threat. Because you are all predators. Because we are all predators. Mivana was quiet for a moment. Her analytical cortex was running at full capacity, and the output was a conclusion that she recognized as important before she could fully articulate it. Your briefings tell you what you look like to us. Palavan's monograph explains why. The behavioral index documents the effect. Your own transit authorities train you to be aware of it. She paused. And none of it helps. No. Because the behavior is preconscious. Your awareness of the effect does not mitigate the effect. You know that you are broadcasting dominance, and you broadcast it anyway because the broadcast is not a decision. It is a physiology. That's correct. Then the awareness is not for your benefit. It is for ours. Your authorities want you to understand the effect so that when a Thanara clerk has a panic response in a galley, you know not to approach. When a Krev submits without cause, you know not to press the advantage. When a Pelvesi flattens against a wall, you know not to move toward them. She looked at him. The awareness is damage control. You are told what you are so that you can minimize the collateral. He held her gaze for longer than he had held anyone's gaze since she had been watching him. 5 seconds. 6. Then he said quietly, yes. And the collateral is loneliness. He did not answer that. He picked up his mug, he drank, he set it down, same spot, 0 variance. She sat with this. She let the information settle the way she let census data settle, layer by layer, each new row adjusting the aggregate until the pattern was clear. I am going to include my observations in a personal report, she said. Not for filing, for my own understanding. Is that acceptable? You don't need my permission to write about what you observe. I am a census coordinator. I am trained to ask. The corner of his mouth moved again, the small knot smile. Then yes, it's acceptable. She stood up. She picked up her nutrient pack container, rinsed it, and placed it in the recycler. She walked to the door. At the door, she stopped. James Oren. Yes. When I entered the galley on day 1, how long did it take you to assess me? Assess you how? The way you assess the Krev. The way you assess every organism that enters a room you are occupying. How long? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, before you reach the dispenser. 3 seconds. About that. And what did you conclude? He picked up his mug. He held it. He did not drink. He looked at her, and his eyes were the same steady, flat, reading eyes they had been since day 1. And they were not unkind, and they were not kind, and they were the eyes of something that had been assessing its environment without interruption for every conscious moment of its life. Census coordinator, he said. Thinara, preherd neurology, stress elevated but managing it, good at patterns, possibly the most observant person on this ship. He paused. Not a threat. You classified me. In 3 seconds, yes. Mivana's secondary eyelids closed and opened. I have been classifying you for 7 days and I have not finished. No, he said, you haven't. She left the galley. Day 8, she did not go to the galley. She worked on her Rithansol projections with a focus that she had not achieved since boarding, and she found the migration variance, and she filed the correction, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a dataset resolved. She also wrote 6 more pages in her personal data slate, not observations of the human, observations of herself, her response patterns, her adrenal cascade timelines, her freeze-loss triggers and their recovery durations, the way her cognition sharpened when the prey brain was engaged, the way her pattern recognition accelerated under fear, the way a computer overclocked under load. She was, she realized, a better analyst when she was afraid. This was a profoundly uncomfortable realization. It suggested that her species' prey neurology, the thing she had always considered a limitation, a vestigial handicap from a homeworld where the primary survival strategy was seeing the predator before it saw you, was in fact a cognitive enhancement. Fear made her notice more. Fear made her categorize faster. Fear made her find the number that did not fit. The human's predatory patience made rooms submit. Her prey species' vigilance made datasets surrender their secrets. Both were involuntary. Both were inherited. Both were, in their own domain, forms of superiority. She closed the data slate and opened it again. She went back to her 7 days of observations, and she reread them. And this time, she did not read them as a frightened herbivore documenting a predator. She read them as a professional analyst examining a dataset, and the dataset told her something she had not expected. James Oren was lonely. Not in any way he would recognize or admit. The data did not show sadness or longing. It showed isolation as a structural condition. He spoke to no one for hours at a stretch. He ate alone. He sat alone. He read alone. The Thinara traveled in groups and maintained herd proximity hums. The Krev argued and jostled and physically occupied each other's space. The Pelvesi communicated through surface contact vibrations and was constantly touching walls and furniture to send ambient social signals. Even the Sorshi, who were largely solitary, had initiated 3 separate conversations with other passengers about academic topics. The human initiated nothing. He responded when addressed. He was courteous, brief, and precise. And then he returned to his stillness, and his stillness created a perimeter that no other species on the ship was willing to cross. He was the apex of every room he entered, and the cost of being the apex was that no one approached. Mivana had approached. She had sat down next to him and spoken to him, and she had done it because her fear had sharpened her analytical capacity until she could no longer tolerate having a dataset she had not resolved, and the unresolved dataset was him. She wondered whether anyone had told him, in the transit briefings that explained how his stillness appeared to other species, that it also meant he would spend most of his interspecies transits alone. She suspected they had. She suspected he had read that section and filed it and moved on, because filing things and moving on was what his neurology was designed to do. She thought about the other Thinara passengers, 4 of them, herself included, on this transit. The other 3 had clustered in the forward compartments from day one, maintaining herd proximity, sharing nutrient packs, humming the low communal frequency that settled cortisol levels. They had not visited the aft section. They had not entered the galley during any of the times when the human was present, which was, Myvana now realized, most of the standard meal windows. They were managing their exposure. They had identified the threat, and they had organized their schedules around avoiding it, and they had done this without discussion, without coordination, without any conscious decision, because herd avoidance of a predator was as automatic as breathing. Myvana had done the opposite. She had moved toward the predator. She had sat next to the predator. She had brought the predator tea. And the reason, she now understood, was not courage. It was not scientific curiosity. It was not even the analyst's compulsion to resolve an open dataset. It was that her fear had become more interesting than her comfort. The 4-beat pattern had become more informative than the herd hum. The predator had become more legible than the data slates. She had, in the language of Palavan's monograph, entered the observation radius of a persistence predator and discovered that the radius was not a trap. It was a classroom. Day 9. She went back to the galley. She sat at the table next to his. She brought 2 containers of pressed root tea. "I do not know whether your species drinks this," she said, placing one in front of him. He looked at it. "What is it?" "Pressed root tea. It is a Thinara staple. It tastes like soil and mild sweetness. Most non-Thinara find it unappealing." He picked it up, smelled it, and drank. He considered the taste with the same still, thorough assessment he applied to everything. "It's not bad," he said. "Earthy." "You are being polite." "I'm being honest. It tastes like beets." "We ate beets." She did not know what beets were. She filed the term for later research. "I have a question." "Go ahead." "You assessed me in 3 seconds. You classified me as not a threat. What would you have done if I had been a threat?" He set the tea down. "What would I have done?" "Your species' predatory patience literature describes a waiting behavior. You wait until the prey is exhausted and then you walk to it. If I had been hostile, if I had been dangerous, would you have waited?" He looked at her, and for the second time something shifted. Not the small knot smile. Something deeper. Something that looked, to her prey species' hyper-calibrated facial expression reader, like consideration. Genuine consideration. The kind that meant he was constructing an honest answer, rather than retrieving a prepared one. "The waiting isn't about prey," he said. "It's about information. We wait because waiting gives us more data. We watch because watching tells us when to move and when not to move. It's not patience in the way your species uses the word, the way you endure something unpleasant. It's patience the way a sensor array is patient. It's always on. It's always collecting. The waiting is the processing. And when the processing is complete, then we act, and we act with everything we've collected." Myvana's ears were fully forward. Her secondary eyelids were open. Her tail was flat, but she was not frightened. Or she was frightened, but the fear was no longer the dominant signal. The dominant signal was the same one she felt when a census dataset cracked open, and the real pattern emerged from behind the noise. "You are a sensor array," she said, "disguised as a man reading a novel about fishing." He laughed. It was a short sound, quiet, contained, and it was the most startling thing he had done in 9 days because it broke his stillness, and the break was so brief and so controlled that it was, in its own way, more impressive than the stillness itself. He could be still, and he could choose not to be, and the transition between the two states was instantaneous. "I like that," he said. "I might use it." "You may." She drank her tea, he drank his. They sat in the galley of a transit cruiser 11 days from anywhere, a prey-species census coordinator and a human observer, and the room did not reorganize itself around his stillness, because she was already in her position and she had chosen it. Midway through the second cup, a Krev freight handler entered the galley, not one of the two from the argument, a third, larger, who had not been present on day 4. He walked to the dispenser, poured himself a protein slurry, turned around and saw the human. He stopped. Mivana watched his face. The Krev had not been briefed. He had not read Palavan. He had no context for what he was seeing, which was a small primate sitting at a table with a mug and a reading device, doing nothing. But the Krev's neurology did what every neurology in the galaxy did when confronted with that specific combination of signals. It classified the stillness. It registered the zero reactivity. It computed the threat matrix. And it concluded that the organism at the table was something that did not need to react, because nothing in the room was capable of threatening it. The Krev took his protein slurry to the farthest table from the human and sat with his back to the wall. James Oren did not look up from his device. He turned a page. He drank from his mug. Mivana said quietly, "He just reorganized." "He chose a defensible position relative to an unknown variable," the human said, without raising his eyes. "That's not submission, that's intelligence." "It is both," Mivana said. The human glanced at her, the not smile. "You're getting better at this." "At what?" "At seeing everything at once." She considered whether this was a compliment or an observation. She concluded it was both, and that the distinction, for his species, might not exist. Day 10. The tailing car entered the Shelf Colony Transit Corridor. Arrival at Vescamai was 16 hours away. Mivana finalized her datasets, formatted her reports, and packed her data slates with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times. In the corridor outside her berth, she encountered one of the other Thinara passengers, a young female named Esya who worked as a supply chain auditor for the Colonial Commerce Office. Esya's ears were folded flat, and her tail was rigid, and her hooves were hammering the 4-beat pattern hard enough to leave scuff marks on the composite. "Are you well?" Mivana asked. "I passed the human," Esya said. Her voice was thin and fast, the Thinara cadence of adrenal overshoot. "In the corridor junction near the fresher. He was standing, just standing, waiting for someone to clear the junction before he walked through. He was being considerate. He was standing in a corridor junction and he was not moving, and I could not make my legs work for 11 seconds. Esya's secondary eyelids were sealed. Why is he on this ship? Why is a human on a transit cruiser? They have their own vessels. They have designated corridors in every station. Why is he here? Because it is a transit cruiser and he is a transit passenger, Mivana said. She heard her own voice and was surprised by its steadiness. He is traveling, as we are. You are not afraid of him. I am very afraid of him. I have been afraid of him for 10 days. But I have also been studying him for 10 days, and I have learned that the fear is mine, not his. He is not generating it deliberately. He cannot help what he is. Esya opened her secondary eyelids. She looked at Mivana with the expression of a junior analyst encountering a senior colleague's methodology and finding it incomprehensible. You have been studying the predator. I am a census coordinator. I study patterns. He is a pattern. He is a 60-kilogram persistence predator with 0 startle latency, an involuntary dominance architecture. Yes, and also a man who reads novels about fishing villages and drinks pressed root tea because I offered it to him, and he said it tasted like beets. Esya stared at her. Then she turned and walked rapidly toward the forward compartments, hooves hammering, and Myvana watched her go and thought, I was her, 10 days ago. I was exactly her. And the distance between what I was then and what I am now is 63 pages of field notes and 2 cups of tea. She stopped at the observation lounge on her way back from the communal fresher. The human was there, watching the approach vectors of the shelf colony orbital infrastructure through the viewport. She sat down, not 8 meters away, 3 meters away. I would like to tell you something, she said. He turned from the viewport, waited. I have spent 10 days studying you. I have filled a personal data slate with observations of your behavior, your response patterns, your interaction frequencies, and your stillness metrics. I have read Palavan's monograph and 4 citation papers. I have analyzed your presence on this ship with the same rigor I apply to population datasets covering 9 colonial systems. She paused, and I have concluded that I was wrong about what frightened me. He said nothing, he waited. The stillness that had unsettled her for 10 days was the same stillness, and she recognized it now for what it was. Not a hunting posture, not a dominance display, not a weapon. It was attention. Pure, sustained, complete attention. He was listening to her the way he listened to everything, with his entire organism, and the thing that had frightened her was not his capacity for patience or his predatory heritage or his involuntary dominance broadcast. It was the fact that he saw her, completely. In 3 seconds or in 10 days, it did not matter. He saw her the way she saw census data, all of it, the clean numbers and the anomalies and the patterns hidden in the variants, and the thing she had been afraid of was being known. I was afraid that you would see me the way I see numbers, she said, and that I would be a number, a classification. Pray heard Thanara, not a threat. I was afraid that being known was being diminished. She looked at him. But you did not diminish me. You classified me and you treated me as a person, and I am not sure how those 2 things coexist, but they do. In you, they do. James Oren held his tea. He did not drink it. He held it the way he held everything, with the quiet, certain grip of a species that had been holding tools for 2 million years and had never dropped one by accident. You walked across a room and sat down next to something your entire neurology was screaming at you to run from, he said. You brought me tea. You asked me questions that most members of my own species don't think to ask. He paused. You're not a number, Myvana. You're the anomaly in the data set, the one that doesn't fit the pattern. That is, she said, and she heard her own voice catch, the highest compliment a census coordinator can receive. I know. She looked at him. He looked at her. And the room was still, and the stillness was not his alone. It was theirs. It was the stillness of 2 organisms who had spent 10 days circling each other with the tools their homeworlds had given them, one watching with the eyes of a predator and one watching with the eyes of prey, and arriving at the same conclusion, that the other one was worth the looking. Day 11. Disembarkation at Shelf Colony Vescam. The boarding corridor was crowded. 3 vessels were disembarking simultaneously, and the terminal was processing passengers from all of them, and the noise and motion and proximity of dozens of alien bodies in a confined space was exactly the kind of environment that triggered every Thanara stress response at once. Myvana felt her adrenal glands activate, felt the 4-beat hoof pattern begin, felt her secondary eyelids flutter. And then she felt it stop. Not because the corridor had quieted, not because the crowd had thinned. Because she had looked back once and seen James Oren walking 20 meters behind her, carrying a single bag, moving through the crowd with the same metronomic stride she had timed on 3 occasions, and the crowd was parting around him the way water parts around a stone, not because he was pushing or signaling or displacing, but because every organism in that corridor, every species, every neurology, was receiving the same broadcast and responding to it the same way. He was the still point in the current, and she had spent 11 days inside his radius, and her neurology had recalibrated, and the crowd that would have overwhelmed her on day one was now just data, just bodies, just organisms responding to stimuli the way organisms do. She was not immune to the fear. She would never be immune, but she had mapped it and measured it and understood its architecture, and understanding had given her something that no herd hum and no herd proximity could provide: the ability to function inside the fear instead of despite it. Myvana collected her case, her data slates, and her formatted reports, and she walked down the boarding corridor to the station terminal. At the terminal they stopped. "James Oren," she said. "Myvana So. I will be filing my personal data slate as an appendix to my transit report. It is not standard procedure, but my supervisor has discretionary authority to approve supplementary behavioral observations. I believe the data has scientific relevance. I'd be interested to read it if you publish." "It will not be published. It is a census coordinator's field notes, not a behavioral paper." "Then it will be the most thorough field notes in the Bureau's archive." She extended her hand, flat-palmed, the Thanara gesture of acknowledged debt. He looked at it, then extended his own hand, and she pressed her palm against his, and his hand was warm and dry and absolutely still. "Safe transit," she said. "Safe counting." She turned and walked into the station. Her hooves clicked against the composite flooring in a steady, even rhythm, not the 4-beat stress pattern, a 2-beat walk, calm, measured. She did not look back because she did not need to. She already knew what he looked like standing still in a terminal corridor. She had the data, all of it. 11 days of it, 63 pages. One anomaly in a dataset she had spent her entire career building. The human turned and walked the other way, and Myvana So, census coordinator, prey-species civilian, carrier of formatted data slates and finder of numbers that did not fit, filed her report and caught her connecting transport and began the next dataset. And she was better at it than she had ever been, because she had learned something in those 11 days that Palavan's monograph had not covered, and that no transit briefing would ever explain. The thing that watches you is not always the thing that threatens you. Sometimes it is the thing that teaches you what watching really means. And the galaxy is full of watchers, and none of them agree on what they see, and the only ones worth trusting are the ones who sit down next to the thing they fear and offer it tea.